Shalom and welcome to another in our series of podcasts from Temple Beth Am, a dynamic center for conservative Judaism in Los Angeles.
We are in Parashat Shemini, which is usually or most frequently known for two different things. And as is often the case in this class, we will be talking about neither of them. One of the things for which this Parsha is most often known for is it's the initial place in the Torah where we get a list of the living creatures that we can consume and the living creatures that we cannot consume, unless you ascribe to a plant-based whole food diet. And that is sometimes what we talk about. We will not be talking about that today. There is another tragic and fairly well-known story that we're going to talk through the beginning of, and part of what we were talking about today will sort of be adjacent to that, but it's not what we're going to focus on. Jacki, any other Parsha preamble? All right, no more Parsha preamble. Okay, so even though this is a bit different from the way we usually do things, we're going to be focusing in on some verses in chapter 10, but I want to back us up a little bit to the end of chapter 9, because 9 gives us the context for the beginning of 10, and the beginning of 10 gives us some context for the verses we're going to focus in on. So over the course, it just occurred to me, it's called Parashat Shemini, but it starts in chapter 9. That was a missed opportunity.
Because that's how they name the Parshas.
I know.
They name them by what chapter they started.
I know, but it's like, come on, Torah, that was a missed opportunity. Okay. Come on, Torah is a phrase that doesn't really make sense. Okay, so over the course of chapter 9, we hear about a series of sacrifices, right? We've heard in these previous couple of parshiot, starting the book of Leviticus, about different sacrifices that are being offered. And as chapter 9 is unfolding, we're moving from hearing about them into reading about how they're actually now being done, how we're moving from theory to action, right? We've heard about how the sacrifices should look, and now we're hearing, okay, well, and Aaron is actually going about performing these offerings in real time, essentially. And here towards the end of chapter 9, like verse 22, Aaron lifted his hand up to the people. He's blessing them after making these offerings. And then these really evocative two verses at the end of the chapter. Moses and Aaron go into the Ohel Moed, where all this is unfolding. They came out, and then they both bless the people, and this really interesting image. And they behold the glory of God, right? It's passive voice, right? The glory of God appeared before all of the people, Kavod Adonai. And then in this sort of interesting connection to foreshadowing to the narrative that's going to happen next, and this fire comes out from before God and sort of like consumes everything, it gobbles everything up, the burnt offering, the fat, and when all of the people see this, they shout and they fall on their faces. So it's this really dramatic, intense climax of the offerings that have been made in this place. Yeah? Okay. Now we move into an incident that folks might know of that's really, really challenging and fairly painful. We're not going to be focusing on this today, but it is, depending on how you read it, connected to the verses that we are going to be talking about. So in the beginning of chapter 10, Nadav and Avihu, Aharon's sons, they take their censer, not censer, like don't say that, but incense holder. They put fire in it, they put incense in it, and they offer this sort of amorphous, confusing, interesting phrase. They offer a strange fire, Eish Zara, before God, which they had been told not to do. And then in a almost exactly similar phrasing to verse 24 of the previous chapter, this fire goes out from God, but it doesn't consume what they're offering. It consumes them, and the two of them die before God. Moses then, in probably some of the worst Nichum Avelim possible, were not particularly comforting as a brother, says, this is what God had said, I will be sanctified in them that come near me, and before all the people I will be glorified. And then a phrase that folks might have seen before, Vayidom Aharon, and Aaron was silent. Aaron doesn't say anything. We can say a lot about these verses. We're not focusing on this narrative piece today. We might circle back to it a bit in the Kushiot, but for now I'm just going to move us through into the verses that we're going to be discussing in greater depth. Moses calls relatives to come carry them out from the camp, and they do. The corpses of Nadav and Avihu are, well, depending on how you read it, Nadav and Avihu are taken out of the camp. And Moses sort of prescribes mourning rituals to Aaron and his remaining sons. That they should let their hair grow. That they shouldn't. Rather, he says what they shouldn't do. Don't have your hair grow long. Don't rip your clothes. I misread that for a sec. But because if you do that as leaders, right, then anger will come upon all the people. And like all of Israel will sort of mourn this. And similarly, he sort of then tells them sort of what else they shouldn't do, like don't go out from this door, lest you die, sort of cautioning them for how they should handle things moving forward, even though it's somewhat counterintuitive for how you would think family members of people who have died would go about mourning those people. Jackie, you were going to correct. Did I course correct there? Did I get us back on track?
Yeah. I was just going to tell you that it's the opposite of he gives you the morning rituals, but then says don't do them.
But then says don't do them, right? Because of sort of like the
so you weren't wrong. You just missed a crucial fact.
You're not wrong. You're just completely wrong. Okay. So that is kind of the narrative backdrop for what we're doing, for what we're going to be focusing in on today. So the verses that we are going to be focusing in on a bit greater depth are chapter 10, verses 9, 10, and 11. We could talk about tragic death. We could talk about kashrut. We're going to talk about wine instead. Okay. God says to Aaron, verse 9, Yain v'shechar al tesht. You should not drink wine or strong drink. Ata uvanecha icha bevoachem el ohel moed velo tamutu. You shouldn't drink it, nor should your sons drink it when you go into the Ohel Moed, the tent of meeting, lest you die. Chukat olam ledorotecha. This should be an eternal law, an eternal statute throughout the generations. Ulahavdil bein hakodesh uvein hachol. It'll differentiate between that which is, I'll go with the basic translations as always, translation is interpretation, but we'll go with sort of the most normative translations of these words between the holy and this is unholy. I'll just read it. Between the holy and the unholy, uvein hatamet, uvein hatahor, between that which is, it says unclean and clean. I don't like that. Between that which is impure and that which is pure, even though that's also imprecise.
You could use fit and not yet fit.
Fit and not yet fit. You like that better? That's your preferred translation?
I don't know. I also have trouble with it, but it's one that I heard that I dislike less than many others.
Okay, we'll go with that. Between that which is not yet fit and that which is fit. Ulaharot et b'nei Israel, and in teaching the people of Israel, et kol hachukim asher diber Adonai alehem yad Moshe, teaching them all of these statutes that God spoke unto them by the hand of Moshe. So one sort of just general framing of this to put a slightly finer point on it, which is that lots of commentators, not surprisingly, read these verses as sort of an explanation of what happened with Aaron's sons who were killed, right? They sort of connect it with, what must have happened here, because that story is somewhat ambiguous. They must have been drinking. They must have been drinking before they went in, and that was the problem. So that's often seen as a connection. And even separating it out a bit more narratively, I think there's some interesting stuff to explore here in terms of thinking about wine, alcohol, consequences for drinking, what it means to differentiate between that which is holy and that which is not. what it means to teach, how you set that up. So I think in addition to possibly separate from that narrative piece, I think there's what to explore here. Jacki, any other thoughts from you before we open it up for Kushiyot?
It's interesting because I definitely grew up in the school of like, these two stories are clearly connected. Like, it was one of those moments of you think something is in Torah, and then it turns out it's either midrash or interpretation.
Right.
But it's interesting because it also draws me into the like, well, they clearly made a rule. Like, they don't legislate things that people don't do.
Right.
So it's like an interesting, so there's clearly some reason they made this rule, and also the fact that they put them together is interesting, but it doesn't guarantee that one happened because of the other.
Yes, right. You don't create legislation unless there's a need to have that legislation in place. You don't need to have a speed limit unless people would drive as fast as they wanted on the highway without the speed limit. And that's how you know I'm not originally from Southern California, because I said highway instead of freeway. Okay. Sarah makes that point all the time. I'm better than I used to be, but I still say highway. Okay. Kushiyot, Tybel's coming in hot. Tybel, what do you got?
Well, first, I didn't know that about highway versus freeway. I'm very glad to learn that.
I think so, right? Is that Southern SoCal natives? Am I correct? If I say highway, do you know I'm not from here? Are there any SoCal natives? No one's actually from here.
I'm a native.
Yes, that is correct. Because when I go to the east, they think I'm funny because I say freeway.
There you go.
Okay. What about Parkway, though?
Oh, well, that's
That's New York.
Yeah,
that's a Long Island thing, actually, because the Northern State Parkway and the Southern State Parkway and the Cross Island Parkway are all built by Robert Moses. So he was the one who actually coined the term in that.
And don't forget the Hutch.
The Hutchinson River Parkway, that's correct. But that's not Long Island. That's Westchester.
Yeah, I know. Anyway, okay. Having been someone who worked in Valhalla for years. Anyway, okay, Valhalla.
I'm so glad we've done a taxonomy of names for very big roads across the country. It's good to have new wrinkles.
But here's the question. Yes, absolutely agree. You don't make a rule unless it's an issue or some things. But then how do you balance that with the rabbi's need to cover exhaustively all logical outcomes?
So do
you know what I'm saying?
As a theoretical question, you're saying.
As a theoretical question. I'm not saying that they contradict each other. I'm not saying that. But I'm saying then that leads to, given that both those things are true, and even some, if we look at the rebellious son, where then the rabbis legislated it out of existence, and maybe they did for soda, maybe they didn't, who knows? But how then can you distinguish when it was a situation where it was really needed versus just covering all the bases that matches somebody's baseball cap?
It's a really interesting question. I think that class in and of itself could probably be its own, like a response to that could be its own like 3-part seminar in terms of Jewish law. So I have a lot of thoughts on that, but I'll let it kind of simmer for now. Ilan, yeah.
I'm actually curious as to when the rabbis decided that verse 9, do not drink wine or strong drink, except for on the holiday of Purim, Simchas Torah, and certain Shabbat onigs. When did the rabbis say, well, actually, they didn't really mean don't drink it ever in the tent of meeting, but, only on certain occasions?
Great. So the verse seems to say pretty clearly to caution against drinking. And yet, many shuls and many Jewish communities have that woven into certainly holiday celebrations, and depending on what it's like and how Shabbat is often celebrated, right? So how do we think that through? Yeah, is that a decent encapsulation of that question? Great, it's a good question. Renee.
I was going to ask something similar to Elon. How do we account for Shabbat or any of the simchas that we are allowed to drink? And what about the daughters and the wives? Are they allowed to drink?
Interesting.
Is it only when we go in the tent that we can't drink? Like if we go to the beach, can we drink?
Great. So you're great close read. Renee gets the close reading of the verses point of the day so far.
I also enjoy that I enjoy the questions like titles that are out there where it's like, I could teach an entire class. And I also enjoy the questions where it's like, I read 7 different commentaries that answer all of your questions. I don't think I brought any of them in the end, but like there are answers in Chazal to those questions, which I also sometimes.
You can get back to me, Jacki.
I'll get back to you. Some of them I'll answer, but.
Yeah. And I'll say, first of all, like, just to sort of, celebrate how closely and rabbinically you're reading those verses for a minute, right? Like you're seeing the verse and you're saying, well, what about this category of people? And what about this place? Like excellent internalization of the rabbinic process. That's like exactly how it's done. That's awesome. I guess women can drink as much as they want wherever they want. So have at it, ladies.
Renee might be doing it right now. We can't.
Yeah, we don't know how Renee cooks. But yeah, getting into like
just for the record, Renee always cooks with wine. Everything tastes better with wine in it.
There you go. But definitely some of what I found also like talked about, well, is this in general or is this a specific location? So I think you're on there. Yeah. Marlise.
Hi, yeah, good morning. Yeah, well, I was questioning like the others about the wine. Like everyone has said, but it's not just only at certain times. It seems like the Kiddush is so central to our celebrations and Shabbat every week. So it's just a contrast. And I'm wondering about the relationship between verse 9 and 10. What were the kind of things in the tent of meeting, I guess, that the Kohanim would have to differentiate and, or if they did, what exactly does that mean? And what is the relationship between drinking the wine and being able to differentiate between holy and unholy and so on?
Great question. Also, rabbinic reading bonus points, right? Like when we see these verses in close succession to each other, that you would assume, right? You would think that they're related. So if and how might they be related? Great question. Nancy.
So I'm interested in the lest you die, because there is obviously the Peshat, like you're going to die. But I'm wondering if there are commentators who wrote about that in other ways, like the you that is you dies as opposed to actually physically dying, or something else about it.
When we see die, how literal or metaphorical might that be?
Right.
Jacki, did you find anything on that?
I did the thing. I did the thing where I talked when I was muted. 2 years, y'all. 2 years, and we're still here. I didn't know, and I didn't even, that's so interesting. Like, I didn't even consider, is it some sort of like metaphorical, because I did the rabbinic thing where I was like, well, these verses come right after someone literally died. Right. So clearly it's talking about literal death.
Right. Yep. But it's a great question. I mean,
yeah.
I think it opens up some really interesting possibilities. Denise.
So I'm looking at number 10, and so like when it said Lavdim ben Koshachol, like boom, Havdalah. And then I thought, how come Tameh and Tahor didn't make it in to Havdalah? Like, because there's all those things, right? Kodesh L'chol, and then whatever it is, Yisroel Lamim, Shesh, I don't know. But there's like a bunch of differentiations, and this isn't one of them. And so I'm just sort of curious why.
Yeah, right. When we say Havdalah, we say, I'm Avdil ben Kodesh L'chol, right, between that which is holy and that which is not. Ben Yisrael Lamim.
Yeah, and Or L'choshech is in there.
And Yom HaShvi L'Sheish Yemei HaMaseh, like the 7th day, and the rest of the days. So like, if you were to think potentially that this kind of liturgically hyperlinks the liturgical hyperlinks, there we go. That's a good band name. If we were to liturgically hyperlink this over to Havdalah, why. I mean, that's kind of a like an inverse kushya, right? Like it's a kushya from a vacuum into like why the liturgy is structured the way it is. I definitely do not have an answer for it, but it is a very interesting question, right? Like if we're seeing this phrase here, which from a not particularly exhaustive search of the process, I think this is the first time this phraseology shows up in the Torah. Like I don't know that we've seen this before. Jacki's making a face like she might agree with me.
I'm just so excited because one of the texts I brought is related to this question.
Oh, great.
I'm so excited now.
I will do something very unusual for me and stop talking. And I will turn it over to Jacki because that sounded like a great segue.
Yeah, it wasn't the segue I was going to make, but I'm excited about it.
Take the segues you can get.
So I actually want to start really fast if I can find it. So I didn't put it on my source sheet originally, but I do want to see if I can. My computer, I don't have enough bandwidth apparently. Again, 2 years into this and still can't do it right. Okay, so Rashi on this, Renee, I will tell you, will answer a lot of your questions. So the first thing I thought of when I was reading this is I immediately thought of the story of Hannah in the book of Samuel, that she comes and she's pouring out her heart and Eli the prophet is like, "Are you drunk, woman?" And she's like, "No, I'm just praying." And so clearly there's a culture that like drinking and shul is not great. And I also had the same thought as Ilan as like, but wait a second, we do this all the time. And as you read through like the classic medieval commentators, starting with Rashi and going through, and I brought one of them. Who did I bring? I brought Chizkuni. Here, I'll share my screen because this was my favorite of them. The classical commentators sort of go through and they limit the circumstances and they work really hard to say that it's this under this specific circumstances. So Chizkuni comes in and says, yain v'shechar v'gomer, wine and other alcoholic drinks, etc. According to Rashi, the addition of the word v'shechar in this verse is meant to refer to a quantity that will cause drunkenness by the person consuming the wine. So Chizkuni, some of the commentators talk about the place, and Chizkuni focuses on the drink. He says this has also been confirmed in the Talmud, tractate Kritut, where Rabbi Eliezer understands the verse to mean, do not drink wine in quantities liable to result in your becoming drunk or in a manner which will lead to drunkenness. If, for instance, the priest drinking wine had first added water to it in order to weaken its capacity to intoxicate, he would not be guilty of violating this commandment. So it was very interesting to go through and see, to Ilan's point, sort of where the limiting was. It probably is Taibel. I would imagine it comes from Shicher. That it's the Taibel.
I think it's like a Yiddishization, right? Like Taibel asked in the chat, is that the source for the Yiddish word shicher, right? But like think right, which is usually used colloquially and often derogatorily as like a drunk, and like shin, kaf, reish, sechar, shakar, shikor, etc. Right?
And also sheker, right?
You can do fun midrashic things with that. Kuf, not kaf there.
Oh, okay. Cool.
Sheker is lie, right? And here with a kuf, and here it's with a kaf. But that could be very fun midrashically. So Denise, you can have a midrashic party over Shabbat.
I'm tucking that in the back of my brain, Denise. I'm going to use that at some point. I'll give you credit. And then the other, so I thought that was an interesting trend, is like all the ways that the rabbis work to limit this. And then I found this really interesting piece of Gemara that quotes our verse about Havdalah. To Denise's point, because I was trying to find, are there places where the rabbis really actually talk about like the positive use of alcohol? Like they clearly are setting intention, and do they ever talk about it? And so in in Shavuot, it's going through all of these things, and it's talking about all of these options. And one of the ones that comes to Rabbi Chia bar Abba says, Rabbi Yochanan says, anyone who recites Havdalah over wine at the conclusion of Shabbat, as opposed to you can say it over anything that's considered to be like a fancy beverage in your place, in where you live, up to and including a really nice cup of tea. So anyone who recites Havdalah over wine will have male children, as it is written, to distinguish between the holy and the unholy. It literally quotes our verse.
Well, there you go. Now we know. Now we know what's been going on in my house. Finally, we understand what's been happening.
Yeah. Now we know how Rabbi Shapiro makes Havdalah. And it's written there, and it writes it again. It brings a second proof to distinguish between the impure and pure. So it says this again later on in, I think this would be next week's Parsha. I think I don't know my breakdown well enough. And it's stated near it, if a woman conceive and bear a male child.
I actually think it might bridge the Parshiot, because I think
this might be, because it's stated near if a woman conceives, which is the beginning of Tazria, which I only know because that may or may not have been my bat mitzvah parsha some number of years ago.
Oh, we should definitely have you come back next week.
And I'm reading Torah next week. This is my bat mitzvah next week. Tazria is my bat mitzvah. So this is how the parsha begins. It talks about if a woman has a son or a woman has a baby. Boy.
Jackie, can I jump in here for a sec?
Please.
Sometimes the Midrash gives you part of what it's quoting and gives you like part of the context, but not all of it. My guess, my Midrashic guess, is that part of the reason that our verse is being quoted is because sons are specifically cited in the previous verse.
Right.
That's my guess, right? So like, how is this connected to? Because so like Marlies just asked in the chat, are sons supposed to be more holy than daughters? I mean, first of all, we know that the rabbis mildly favor men over women in a few different ways. But I think also midrashically, I think part of the connection is probably because in verse 9, it's Aaron and his sons, right? Like they're specifically cited, and so that would be, I think, at least part of what else is happening here.
And I think
does
this
that make
is also
sense, Jackie?
Yeah, and this is also playing with it because that's what happens at the beginning of Tazria if a woman bears a son or if a woman bears a daughter, and it talks about two different cases.
Yeah.
And then...
Can I ask you a question? Because there's something here that's a little bit troubling, or actually a lot troubling. So it says, anyone who recites Havdalah over wine at the conclusion of the Shabbatot will have sons who are worthy of teaching halacha. What's troubling about that is the implication is that anyone who does not drink wine will at Shabbatot will not have sons who are worthy of teaching halacha. And how does that jive with people who have substance abuse problems, right? That are you suggesting that somebody who has substance abuse problems and therefore chooses not to drink wine is doomed to have, I'm going to use sons, I'll say children instead, who are not worthy of teaching halacha?
So I'm gonna
or other things too besides wine.
Yeah, I'm gonna sort of answer. Then I think I'm actually gonna kick it over to Rabbi Shapiro because my guess is that's the perfect transition question to what he brought. Is my guess, but I could be wrong. But I'll kick it over anyways. But it's interesting because I find this troubling on principle, but rabbinically in the way it's playing with the text, I really love. What I love about it is that it now is connecting. It started with verse 9, and now it went from 9 to 10, and now it's connecting 10 and 11, which just like I think is like a fun thing to play with. That it brings together this distinction and this teaching. And so I agree with you on principle, Elon. I actually, in preparing for this, I'll tell you now, and then at the end when I scoop the wrap up, that when I put the bow on it, that Rabbi Shapiro doesn't know what I'm doing yet, or if I'm doing that. I'll touch on this because that's also, I have a lot of thoughts on it. But I did actually say, like, I have a lot of discomfort around this entire conversation around alcohol, both from a perspective of who am I to tell you to drink or not drink? I don't know your life. And also like, it's a thing. And so I agree with you, Elon. I also sit in discomfort, and I also just like the way the rabbis play with text. And with that, I'm going to kick it over to Rabbi Shapiro.
But first, I'm going to let Tybal say what her hand is up for.
Oh, great.
But I thought with a lot of this that even though it says wine, given that wines are made for grapes, one can do grape juice. Or is that rabbinic? I mean, because some of this becomes less divisive or troubling or whatever you want to say if in your head wine also includes unfermented wine, also known as grape juice, which in fact is a 7th species, blah, 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 all that stuff.
Yeah. I think sources are, I'll say it like this. I think wine is often quoted as being quote unquote preferable, right? And grape juice is also okay too. And in terms of the text that Jackie just brought, which I hadn't read before, but it does seem like they are specifically saying wine, right, Jackie? Which I think is part of where Elon is coming from in his question. I want to zoom like way. I pushed myself back. So I'm going to zoom way out. Push myself back. I'm going to zoom way out to speak to the alcohol piece for a second. So everybody knows I worked at Beit for 6 years. In terms of talking about addiction and alcoholism and those kinds of things. And because I worked there for so long, I sort of like assume that people have had these conversations and have this awareness, and I try to remind myself that not everyone has and not everyone does. Jews can be alcoholics too. Jews can be drug addicts too. It is not restricted to one group of people. It does not differentiate between demographics, gender, race, ethnicity, religion, culture. Addiction does not discriminate. Addiction impacts everyone. And there's actually data to back that up recently. The Jewish Federation in New York just did a really extensive research study across hundreds and hundreds of Jews across the New York area. And what they found was 10% of those Jews say that they have some form of substance abuse. 1 in 10. So if you are at a minyan, odds are one of those people. That's obviously not exactly how that works, but you understand the point. And that is roughly the same percentage that is estimated for the general population. Neither more nor less, right? Rough estimations are 1 in 10 in the general population is some form of substance abuse problem as well. So that's just important to say and acknowledge and notice in terms of being sensitive and thoughtful. Like, Elon, exactly the kinds of questions that you're asking in terms of having awareness around this kind of stuff. On the one hand, yes, this has become heavily normative. Elon, going back to your first question, and, if you are someone who is struggling with alcoholism and you walk into shul and there's someone with a bottle of scotch walking around ready to pour you a l'chaim, that can be really tough, right? Then we're putting someone in a tough situation. How we think about how that implements policy, what we do, right? It's something to consider, but at least having awareness around that stuff is important. By the way, I was doing a deeper dive into the data. This study is really, really interesting. You should just check it out. I mean, New York is not LA. They are different places, but they're not that different. And there's some really interesting numbers in there in terms of the rate of poverty within the Jewish community, mental health issues within the Jewish community. Encourage you to check it out for all your free Googling time between now and Shabbat. And just one other little nugget from that study. Denise, I saw your hand. One other nugget from that study is they have substrata in some of these data points, rates of substance abuse, because you can break it down by income level. They break it down in terms of like at or near the poverty line. By the way, pretty high percent. I think it was close to 20% of Jews in New York hovering around there, and not just in one denomination. 3 percentage points higher, people who are more well off in terms of rates of substance abuse, which is not often what a lot of our political rhetoric would seem to indicate in terms of how alcoholism and substance abuse appear in our communities. So I'm going to hop off that soapbox for the time being. But when we talk about these topics, I think it's important to give that additional framing. Elon, you've like sort of asked a question in both directions, right? You've asked like, how come it's so prevalent? And wait a minute, if we're encouraging this, like, what does that actually mean?
Yeah, but that's because one was the Parasha which said don't do it, and then the rabbinical interpretation was if you have a son, and if you drink wine at Havdalah, your son will be eligible to teach halacha. So
right, all of which seems to be sort of more quote unquote alcohol positive than what this verse is indicating. Yeah, great. So what I'm gonna like bring us back into the verses for a sec and sort of revive the really excellent halachic reasoning from Renee earlier in terms of like doing a close reading of this, which is that what it seems to say is that there's a context, right? There's a context for all of this. When shouldn't you drink? When you go to the Ohel Moed, right? That if you are going to be doing something that is specifically denoted as a holy ritual act, that's not when you should be drinking. Why? Verse 10, to be able to differentiate, right? I would imagine most people on this call have had a drink or two in their day. When you drink, you might get a little bit confused. And if you are doing something that you really need to be focusing on, particularly in a situation when you are a representative of all of the people, to be able to differentiate between that which is holy and less holy, that's an important thing to be able to do in that moment. And I think this is where, Jackie, correct me if I'm wrong, where that Talmud piece is picking up on. And similarly, or I guess it's the inverse. No, I did it again. I did the opposite, right? Because here, this verse seems to be indicating you shouldn't be drinking, right? If you're going to be teaching, and a lot of the medieval commentators talk about how if you are going to sit, right, and make a halachic decision, don't drink beforehand, bad idea. And that seems to come from that verse as well. But Jackie, the Talmud piece you brought, right, in terms of the Havdalah thing, might be pointing in the opposite direction, right?
Right, which is so fascinating.
Right.
Because it's if you drink, then your sons will teach, which is a thing you can't do while you're drinking. Right.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know. I'm not familiar with that Talmud piece. I haven't seen it before. The first thing I'll say, as I have heard said to me many times, is that we don't paskin from the Gemara, right? Like that in terms of what halacha actually ends up looking like, it's not necessarily just like because there's a line in the Gemara about it, right? Sometimes the Gemara is just a compilation of stuff rabbis said a long time ago. That's that one rabbi said, but it's not necessarily what the halakha actually gets formulated as.
Just to note, the whole section, it's actually a bunch talking about this parsha, but it's about like having children and the things that you do, and like, will you have sons or will you have daughters, or it's mostly about will you have sons and like, will you have good kids. It also talks about Nadav and Avihu a few sections earlier. Like, it's rich with parsha.
I want to look at what is it? What are those pages?
Shavuot 18b.
Yes, in all my exhaustive study of every single Masechet of the Gemara, I must have missed the first little bit of Shavuot. But I want to like further problematize this, because there are sources that talk about how like wine gladdens the heart, right? And wine is uplifted, right? Like we have those pieces as well. Tybo's just looking at Renee's cake. We have those pieces too in our tradition.
We're all looking at Renee's cake. Let's be real.
I hadn't been looking at Renee's cake, but let's take a quick pause and spotlight Renee. Renee, is this because you're number one?
No, it's because my granddaughter is turning 1 today, and we're having a Shabbat birthday dinner for her.
Yum,
and I made her a special cake.
Is that like a strawberry shortcake situation?
You know, I don't know. My daughter-in-law gave me this recipe for it's called a smash cake. and it's fairly healthy because there's no sugar in it. And then I made her, she likes these puffs, these like baby puff stuff, which I made her balls out of with peanut butter and maple syrup too. What stuff she'll eat.
Sounds delicious. I got to tell you, folks, where else but on Exploring the Parsha do you not only get Parsha content, but also a taxonomy of large roads across the U.S. and baking tips from Renee Baker. Only here on Exploring the Parsha. Meanwhile, back at the ranch, there are sources in our tradition that actually seem to really praise wine as something that can elevate us, which seems to be very much at odds with what these verses are saying, even if you read them narrowly, right? Even if you read them as talking about a specific context, there seems to be some tension there. One, there's tension across a lot of sources in our tradition, right? Like Judaism is rarely univocal on anything, right? We often get pieces in our tradition that seem to be saying mildly contradictory things. That is often the case, right? Which might be unsatisfying. It's also true. There was a really interesting piece I stumbled upon, not because I was drinking, that I stumbled upon from Reb Simcha Bunim, a Hasidic teacher, and he sort of pushes this in this direction as well. He says, why is this the case? Why is this the case that we're saying don't drink when we have this source that talks about how wine can bring gladness, right? Isn't that what you want, right? Isn't that what you want? That a priest should be somebody who's bringing, right? He says, Ein hashchina shoreh mitoch atzavut, that God doesn't show up when you're sad, right? We can talk about that too. That's an issue as well, right? But God's not necessarily going to appear to, like, in this moment, if you're like feeling down and depressed, like there needs to be some elevation happening here. So why is it that wine is forbidden if wine can bring gladness? Right, wine, since wine is thought to bring happiness. And he says, Ki hakohen shenichnas la'asot avodat Adonai lifnim v'lifnei lifnim. The kohen who's going in to do the service of God, like deep inside in the Holy of Holies, tzarich lekabel regashut chedva v'gil mesimcha shel mitzvah, because he needs to be getting the sense of rejoicing, the sense of connection from the joy of doing the mitzvah itself. That it shouldn't be externally introduced. It needs to be something that sort of comes from within. That if you want to be getting to this place of connection, it's not just that you take a couple of shots and you're feeling great and you say, all right, now I'm ready to go. That there has to be kind of a deeper sense of rejoicing for this person to be able to do this thing, which is still contextually grounded, right? Which is still for this particular person. And then he pushes it a little bit further, and then he says, "V'zeh shehu mekayem mitzvat Adonai, yain v'shechar al tesht, tzarich l'maleh et libo simcha." This sense that you need to have this kind of derived from the joy of doing the mitzvah itself. I think there's a lot in there. I think it's an interesting teaching. I like that it sort of articulates some of the tension that's happening here, and the tension is real. And you know, I would talk about this with folks sometimes very specifically at Beit Tshuva. You know, we'll go in a slightly different direction here, where people would talk about using hallucinogens. There's a lot of talk about using hallucinogens these days, right? There's a lot of talk about how there are different drugs that it seems like might be able to provide actual medical benefits that we haven't seen before. Jackie, you didn't think we were going here at all, did you? But here we are.
I also have a text on this.
Jackie's going to talk about hallucinogens as well. Wow, this is all taken a very interesting turn here on Explaining the Parsha. Okay, because there might be some actual medicinal benefits. So people, you know, who would be meeting with me sometimes would very sort of pleased with themselves say, like, are you saying that you can't have a spiritual experience by, you know, ingesting whatever it is, ayahuasca or something like that? To which I'd say, that's not what I'm saying at all. I can't dictate to you when you are or aren't having a spiritual experience. It's not on me to decipher for you what it is that helps you to feel connected. What I can offer is that yes, that might happen by ingesting a chemical, and hopefully we can wire ourselves so that a sense of spirituality and connection and elevation and joy are not only something that happens when we ingest something, but it's something that we can manifest within ourselves. I think that that's really important. And I think that maybe that's something that these teachings can be pointing us to, while recognizing that, we have gotten to a place in our culture where there is drinking on Purim, where there is often drinking on Simchat Torah. That's often part of it. I would offer like all things in proper measure. What does proper measure mean? That's up to each person to decide. And there's sources in our tradition, that talk about how wine gladdens the heart, and that's in there too. I don't think it's univocal, and I think there's what to say in a couple of different pieces here. Pavel, you've got your hand up.
I actually don't usually read it, though it comes, but the latest Hadassah magazine, and I think of Hadassah as, it's mainstream. The articles to me are kind of watered down, but I read it. There's an article on using psychedelics in treating trauma in Hadassah magazine, which to me then says this is really mainstream in the Jewish community if Hadassah is writing about it.
Yeah, it's definitely something that's gaining more credence in sort of like mainstream Jewish thinking. The conservative yeshiva, which I would not necessarily say is a radical place of learning, at some point in the pandemic had people teaching about, how Judaism and, chemical compounds of that nature can interact. And Elon's going to tell us all about the time that he tripped acid at a Yankees game. Yes, Elon.
I'm speechless. I'm curious as to if there is anything in the rabbinic tradition that deals with substance abuse, right? Where because clearly there were people, they might not have labeled it alcoholics, but clearly there were people who drank too much through time. They allude to it, but was there ever any situation where saying, you know what? Yes, we do have a tradition that does celebrate with wine, and there are certain holidays like Purim where you're encouraged to take it a little bit or a lot of it beyond what is normally acceptable. But we acknowledge that there are people who this may be difficult for. Is that just a modern understanding and no place do the rabbis really deal with it, or does our tradition deal with it?
It's a great question. Like, to answer it on one foot, I think it's more the latter than the former. Right? And I think that's the way a lot of rabbinic literature is written, like rather than diagnosing like specific societal ills in terms of like the inner psychology of what people are experiencing, they talk about it without necessarily talking about it, is how a lot of it is structured in terms of what I've seen, while also talking about Shmirat HaGuf, like protecting your body. And there is a teaching from Hillel where he talks about how he's going to the bathhouse and people criticize him because there are idols there. And he says, no, like it's important, like God gifted me this body, I need to take care of it. So a lot of the constructs that I've seen specifically looking for rabbinic sources around addiction itself have grounded it mostly in like taking care of yourself, since it's a gift from God, and then extrapolating that out in terms of if you are someone who is experiencing addiction, who is navigating alcoholism, therefore the importance of taking care of yourself. That's most of what I've seen. The story that also comes to mind, I'm going to read out what Jacki put in the chat, and then I'll share one more thing, and then Jacki's going to bring us home with hallucinogens and Judaism and bows, which is that Jacki put a source from Pnimei Halacha that talks about restricting like your substance use when you are doing ritual specific things, right? The Torah commands Kohanim not to enter the temple, like, because that's at odds with what idol worshipers do. Idol worshipers would use drugs and alcohol. Kohanim shouldn't have done that. And then the Chachamim derive from this that one who is drunk or tipsy is prohibited from praying. The source that often, or the location that a lot of this often comes up with is around Purim, right? That you should drink ad shaleda, right? Until you don't know the difference between Haman and Mordechai. Nobody booed. You guys weren't paying attention. But there's a reading of that reading that says, what does it mean, ad shaleda? When you're sleeping, if you're sleeping, you can't tell the difference between Haman and Mordechai. So just have a little l'chaim and you'll probably pass out, right? Like, it doesn't necessarily mean get so hammered that you can't tell the difference between the good guy and the bad guy, right? There's something for that too. And there's a story in the Gemara that talks about how there were two, Jackie, do you want to tell the story, Jackie? Basically, there were two rabbis who were hanging out together on Purim, and one of them got so drunk that he decapitated the other guy, and he was somehow then miraculously revived. And then the next year, the guy who decapitated the second guy goes down and says, hey, let's party again. And the second guy says, we shouldn't rely on miracles, right? Like, fool me once, shame on me for being decapitated. Fool me twice, you should probably go to rehab, right? So like, in the sense that, yes, maybe that's a thing, but it shouldn't be so much of a thing that it's that kind of a thing. You know, like it's in the story in that kind of way, and you don't have to look too hard to find it. So that's a somewhat scattershot and not comprehensive answer to your question, Elon, but hopefully that gives you at least something to go on. And with that, Jackie's going to somehow magically wrap all that up, in addition to saying something else about hallucinogens.
No, I brought my point on hallucinogens, though I did have a lot of really interesting conversations at camp this past summer about like Judaism and ritual and music and hallucinogens. Like, it was a very interesting conversation at camp. I also love the story of not this time, don't rely on miracles. But like I said, when Rabbi Shapiro and I started talking about this, when we kind of picked this verse, I definitely was like, I don't know how I feel about talking about alcohol and alcoholism and all of the complexities that come with it. And it's interesting because I will also shout out, I did a rabbinic intensive with Beit Shuva, and I love the question, where do you see yourself in the Parsha? And as I was reading this, I think to me, what really struck me was this piece about, now I can't find it. Hold on. I got it. For being able to distinguish between the sacred and profane. And so for me, the question really came to like, okay, but why is it saying this? It's not like, it's interesting that it doesn't just say, don't drink when you do this. And it does say, don't drink lest you'll die, but it doesn't say, don't drink, period, next topic. And it's clearly giving us a reason. And that was what I was sitting with. And I realized, I think for me, what I drew out of this is about presence, is that ultimately what is being asked for is to be present in the moment. And again, I think this is both a gift and a challenge to us of how do we look at service of God, or service of community, or service of others, or service of ourselves, and how do we look at these moments in our lives and what it takes to be present. And it might mean not being drunk at shul, and it might mean it putting down your cell phone when you're having dinner with friends, and it might mean all of these other things. It'll mean different things to different people, but I think that as I am someone who, telling me not to get drunk doesn't really, you can tell me, but I don't necessarily need to be told. But for me, that's really, really the lesson in this one of what are the moments in my life that I need to not be drunk on other things like my cell phone or work or whatever it is, and how to find those moments.
Was that the bow?
That's the bow.
Are you tying the bow?
I tied the bow.
I'm going to step on your bow. Sorry. But
that's what we do. I tie the bow, and then you tie your own bow.
Okay. I do want to say, like, because it's a serious topic, in all seriousness, if you are on this call, if you are listening, if you know someone for whom this applies, if you know someone who's struggling with alcoholism, with addiction, we are here to help. I am here to help. Please let us know. Can be extremely difficult and painful, and there are ways of navigating it that are out there, and we are here to try to support folks in that. And the last thing I will say is, addiction is sometimes people ask, like, why do people drink? Why do people use? Whatever it might be. People can do that for any number of reasons. And oftentimes people do it to numb or to escape pain, or because life can be feeling really difficult. We're on an upward trajectory with a lot of this COVID stuff. It's still not easy right now, and it hasn't been easy for the past couple of years, and rates of addiction and alcoholism have really been going up. And anyone who is struggling, anyone who is in need for anything, certainly including alcoholism and addiction writ large, deserve our love and compassion and help and care. So I just want to make sure to offer that up as well, because
it's really hard to be a human. It's hard to be a human.
Yep, it's hard to be a human, and everybody encounters tough times, and probably the most important thing we can do as a community is show each other love and support when we need it. And that is one of the ways that we can do that. So with that, I hope you have a Shabbat that is filled with lots of love and support and care from you to the people you love and from the people you love to you. And happy birthday to Renee's granddaughter. And bless you, Jackie.
Can I just add to what you said that with this regards to the drug and alcohol, that I did my master's internship at the Chabad Drug Rehab. And it was exactly what you were saying earlier, that when I first started there, I was under the impression that, we're Jews, us Jews, we're smart, we're beyond doing drugs and alcohol. And it was a big culture shock to me. And it's even more so, I think, among the Jewish community, because there's still such a stigma against it, to be there for our community, because many times the young people who are in a more religious community are excommunicated from their families because of those problems. So it's really important that we as a community are here for them even more so.
100%.
That's my plug.
Smart has nothing to do with it. Some of the smartest people I have or will ever meet have, and for some still have, major issues with addiction. Smarts have nothing to do with it. Addiction doesn't discriminate in any way, shape, or form. And we're here to help in the ways that we can for the people we can help.
And I have to show you something real quick.
Okay, but I'm going to stop the recording. And with that, Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom, everyone.
You have been listening to another in our series of podcasts from Temple Beth Am, a dynamic center for conservative Judaism in Los Angeles. If you enjoy these podcasts, we invite you to write a review on the Apple Podcast site or wherever you get your podcasts. For more information about Temple Beth Am Los Angeles, go to tbala.org.